Welcome to the second lecture in Module 2, and in this lecture we'll build our first Rails application. What you need is to have a working development environment, so hopefully you're at that point. And once you have that working, you need to type Rails new, and let's call this application my_app. I'm going to talk you through this, and then I'm going to show you how I did this on my own machine. Next, you need to change directories into the directory that Rails just created for you. You need to start the web server, and this is done using Rails server. And finally, you need to point a browser to http://localhost:3000. And that will attach to this web server and deliver up a web page. Let's see. So here I've opened a terminal window, and I'm going to enter the commands that I just showed you, starting with Rails new my app. And recall that I told you previously that Rails comes with a number of code generators, and this is one of them. The new command, when I hit return, will create a number of directories that you see here, and now it's running the bundle install command. And what the bundle install command does is it ensures that you have the right gems necessary for your application. And in order to install those gems, it wants my system password. So I'm going to enter that. After I do that, it'll start to install these gems. And every new Rails application that you create, you should run this command, bundle install. And here it's being done automatically for us. What happens when you do this is the gems that you need, and remember, gems are just libraries, and the gems that you need in order to run your Rails application are included as a part of your application when you do this. And here you see that all of the gems that are required in order to run just your first Rails application are shown here. And so this is it. Now, you now have a working Rails application, and if you do bundle show, as it says here, it'll show you the gems that you have installed. Now we're going to cd to my app, as I mentioned, and we'll see here if we do an ls, we'll see all of the files that are there. And if you run bundle check, it'll tell you if you have all the gems that you need in order to run your application. And here it tells you that your gem file dependencies are satisfied. We'll talk more about the gem file. This is where your gem dependencies are specified in a future lecture. But for right now, it looks like we're good to go. We have a working Rails application, and in order to run it, we need to type Rails server, and this will start a web server that will run your Rails application. And here we see that it's running WebRick 1.31, and it says here that if you want more information about how to use the Rails server, type Rails server help. So let's do that right now. Rails server, actually -h for help. And it tells you that the default port that Rails runs on is 3000 and that the address is 0.0.0. So this is the default binding to the IP address. And so what this means is if we run Rails server, again, it's going to start up this WebRick server, and it tells you on port 3000 is where you can find this. And so if we open a web browser at this point and point it to 0.0.0 as the address and port 3000, we should see this application running. So let's do that. Here I've opened a web browser, and if I type 0.0.0.0:3000, it will take us to the working Rails web application. And here it says, welcome aboard, you're writing Ruby on Rails. And if you click on this button, it'll tell you all about your Rails application. And something very nice that Rails does for you, it gives you the next step. So it says if you'd like to generate some models and controllers, and we'll talk more about that shortly, here's what you need to do. If you need to set up routes, we'll talk about that later. Here's what you need to do. And if you need to create a database and connect it to your application, these are the next steps. And if you notice over here, there's all sorts of guides provided for you that I encourage you to look at that tell you how to use Rails and Ruby as well. If we click on About Your Application, it tells us all of the information about this Rails application. So what this demonstrates is that we have a working web application. And In future lectures, I'll show you how to connect a lot more things to this in order to make this web application a lot more functional. Let's talk a little bit more about the address 0.0.0.0:3000. Recall that the WebRick web server is running now on your machine, and it's listening on this port. You can also get to this same server by typing localhost:3000, and when I do that, you see that it's redirected to the same WebRick server, and this web page is served up. Let's return to the terminal window and look at the files that were created. If I type ls, you can see a list of the files that the Rails new generator created for us. Let's talk about each of those now. Let's take a look at the directories that the Rails application created for us. There's RAILS.root at the top, and in this case it's called my_app. It's going to be the name that you use when you ran the Rails new command. One of the most important subdirectories is the app subdirectory. This is where your model, view, and controller code is stored. In the bin subdirectory is where there are a number of helper scripts, and we've already run some of them: bundle, Rails, and rake. In the config directory is where you set up the application specific configuration, you configure your database, and the routes that are associated with your application. In the DB subdirectory, we've seen that's where our database schema and the database itself are located. The gem file, that specifies the required gems. In the log subdirectory is where application logs are created. If you run your Rails application that was just created and look at that log directory, you'll see all of the various ways in which this web application was accessed, captured in those logs. In the public subdirectory, that's the root of your application. So there are a number of files there for the various errors that may occur. So you'll see a 404 and a few other files that are HTML files that if there's an error, those files are pulled up and delivered to the user. And finally, in the test subdirectory, as I've already shown you, this is where all your tests exist. And now testing, again, is part of an agile development process that we'll talk about a lot more in subsequent lectures. So this is the list of subdirectories that the Rails application creates for you. It's very important that you get to know these because this is how you'll modify and change your applications. So this completes the second lecture in Module 2.